On the topic of diversity, one of the anchors of diversity is this idea of a plant species. So plant species are groups of individuals that could be mating with each other, can successfully make offspring together. And there should be fairly similar within. This is one of the principles we have for being able to identify a species, is that any individual of that species, you should be able to know what it is by matching a set of characteristics that it has. And then it'll be different from other species. So we'll see some examples where sometimes a couple of species are closely related and very similar to each other. Other times a species is very different from everything else you might run into. That's a big part of identification. So I guess we'll kind of think of during this whole course, the second question, why does it matter? Why does it matter to have different species? We've already seen some examples. So for example, a plant that's got one kind of pollinator or one kind of animal that eats it, sometimes that's exclusive to a species, and two different species would have different pollinators or different herbivores to watch out for. So when we talk about species, species are at the bottom of this so-called hierarchical classification scheme. Let me spell that out for you. Hierarchical. Hierarchy. Which is basically a system where one category is contained within another category. So if you have a genus, then some part of that is a species. You might have a couple of species, you might have 1,000 species in a genus, but they're contained within this category. Species 1, species 2. And so on, illustrated a lot better in this image that I borrowed. So species are contained within genus. The plural of genus is genera. I'm gonna dwell on this for a second because people like to spell it differently and pronounce it differently. All right, so the category is genus, G-E-N-U-S. Plural is genera. It's not pronounced genre or anything like that. Genre is a French word, and that's a sort of like a kind of movie. What's your favorite genre? They're born out of the same root word. This goes back to Latin. Genus means basically like a clan. So we have all these different categories for groups of things that belong together, and kind of built out of a set of language terms that we have for being related. So one of the terms we'll see is family, clan, or genus. Anyway, genus, genera, species belong to genera belong to families belong to orders belong to classes, and so on up. And we'll talk mostly in this class about this set, species through family, and a big emphasis on the level of family. So if you've got these anchor points of understanding your different plant families you're likely to run into, then you'll be well equipped for immediately looking at a plant and in many cases putting it to the right family right away. Saves you a whole bunch of time identifying it. That's one of the big reasons we spend time on family. These levels above order, they're getting less strictly regulated. So I don't know if people talk as much as they used to about class and phylum and kingdom and so on, but they are still hierarchical. So above the level of order, around the level of class, they have this division between monocots and eudicots. So grasses and their relatives versus, I don't know, olives and their relatives. The majority of flowering plants are in this eudicots group. Above that are the flowering plants are a phylum, and they would be contrasted with the conifers or the gymnosperms, the mosses, and so on. And then all the way up to kingdom. This category of kingdom is basically plants. So all land plants together comprise a kingdom. And then above that, the domain, this idea of domain, there are 3 domains: eukaryotes, bacteria, and archaea. And so this is kind of a context of global organism diversity and how the plants fit into that. So just a little illustration here of kind of the levels of diversity. I think it's sometimes hard to picture, like, what is an order? So what I've got here are these bold white lines that separate out 2 or more of these groups that I'm talking about. So in the order category, we've got an order on the left here. This is the order called Asterales, includes sunflowers and relatives. And so this order would contain several different families. So we've got Asteraceae here, Adoxaceae, Menanthaceae, all contained within this Asterales group. Over here in the monocots, this is Asparagales, includes the plant asparagus, also the orchids, also iris and lilies. Not all the lilies, I'm sorry. Anyway, this one, the yellow stargrass. So very diverse within these groups, but still on the right, these feature some monocot features, and then these have some eudicot features. And if you know them well enough, you look for something else that might tie them all together as belonging to the same order. And then kind of narrowing in, we're going to get into groups that are more and more similar. So within the same family, these 2 plants are both in Adoxaceae. These 2 are both in the Asteraceae. These are both in a family called Xeridaceae. And you can maybe see some similarity there, some kind of almost like a pine cone cluster of flowers here, 1, 2, 3 petals in both cases, some kind of feathery stigma there. And then getting closer and closer to similar, more related. So a couple in the genus Symphyotricum, the asters. These are 3 at the bottom in the genus Viburnum. Here we've got a couple in the genus Xyris. And so they are, basically within the smaller categories, the more closely related, they'll also more or less will look more similar to each other. So with this diversity, you can kind of piece it together at small levels and then big levels, all in these big hierarchical categories. We'll also talk about the fields of nomenclature. Nomenclature is something that students at your level typically aren't worried too much about, but we're going to talk about it, and I think it's helpful to have some perspective on basically what is the right name for a particular plant. So this is an example here of a plant that people sometimes disagree about what it should be called. It's called Hepatica is its common name, common Hepatica. And depending on the person you ask, they might say it's called Anemone Hepatica, or somebody might tell you it should be called Hepatica acuteloba. And so it's important to be able to have the tools to know which name you prefer to use. So nomenclature. Next topic here is taxonomy. And these are topics that are kind of subdivisions of this whole topic we're talking about for the course. So nomenclature is a field that deals with names. So basically, like, what is the right name to call something? Taxonomy deals with categories. So which category does it belong to? And that's what this slide is meant to illustrate. So we've got one plant, and it's been over many years here. You can see a variety of years here. From 1803 to 1823, this same plant species was put in a variety of different categories. So that first name of its 2-name species name, this first word is the genus name. So Dalabarda fragarioides said this person, Michaud, said it should belong to this genus Dalabarda. Someone later said, no, that should probably go into the genus Rubus. That's actually the genus of blackberries and raspberries. And then subsequent to that, someone else came along and said this should belong to a genus called Waldsteinia. So the process of putting this same plant in different categories is a process that eventually we like to think ends up in the right category, but sometimes it goes through a few different iterations before it gets there. Putting organisms into different categories, that's what taxonomy does. A little more recently, this field of phylogenetics has really taken over the idea of how we put organisms into classification. So phylogenetics is a field that deals with these phylogenetic trees, and they show us a reconstruction of evolution. So over time, diversification, and we can actually see on here where closer related species might share features in common, or have a set of features that help us to classify them. So phylogenetics, we'll spend some time actually doing some phylogenetics. This is a big field these days. And it's been able to provide a lot of new strides in understanding diversity and helping out with classification. I'll just put on here, the keyword is more like evolution. So phylogenetics deals with these evolutionary trees and trying to understand diversity in terms of how it got there from a common ancestor. So some illustrations here, different flower petal colors, and they go a little bit along with inheritance. So these red dots here, these red dots that I'm circling right now are all descended from the same ancestor that also had red dots. So a little helpful, maybe a helpful match of features in common and also close relatedness is one of the things we really look for. And then kind of over connecting all these other fields together is this field called plant systematics. The taxonomy, or sorry, the textbook you have is a systematics textbook. It's called Plant Systematics. And I like to think of the field of systematics as basically encompassing all these other categories together. So systematics, it's kind of built into the name. You take like a systematic approach, is basically considering all evidence and trying to make it all make sense in terms of what do we call it, how do we classify it, how did the diversity get to be what it is. So just an illustration here of a few different components. We got a set of fossil pollen grains here, and then biogeographical distribution and where these fossils were found. And then also part of this study could be some phylogenetic study and so on. And eventually somebody knows a whole lot about this genus Magnolia. All right, so that's that topic. Next up, we'll be talking about vegetative morphology.